The line crackled in the darkness beneath Berlin as shells shook the city above. Somewhere deep underground, a voice that once commanded continents leaned toward a telephone, knowing, perhaps for the first time, that no one was truly listening anymore. These were not calls of victory or vision. They were calls made at the edge of extinction, spoken by a man whose power was dissolving minute by minute. By April 1945, Adolf Hitler was no longer the distant dictator framed by banners and roaring crowds. He was confined to the Führerbunker, a concrete tomb beneath the ruins of his capital. The Red Army was closing in from the east, Allied forces from the west, and the empire he had promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing in a matter of days. In this claustrophobic world, the telephone became his last illusion of control, a thin wire connecting him to generals who could no longer obey and to a future he could no longer shape. Each call carried the weight of denial. Hitler demanded reports that confirmed his fantasies, not the truth unfolding outside. When reality intruded, when officers admitted that armies existed only on paper, his voice reportedly shifted between icy calm and explosive rage. He accused commanders of betrayal, cowardice, and treason, unable to accept that his own decisions had engineered this catastrophe. The telephone, once an instrument of command, now exposed the widening gulf between his will and the world. In these final days, Hitler clung to the belief that a single decisive movement could still reverse fate. Calls were made to field commanders, urging non-existent counterattacks, insisting that relief forces were hours away when they were already destroyed. Each conversation followed the same grim pattern: demand, refusal, disbelief, fury. Cause led relentlessly to effect. Years of centralized control had hollowed out initiative. Blind loyalty had replaced honest counsel. Now, when he needed truth most, there was none left to give. Psychologically, these calls reveal a man imprisoned by his own ideology. Hitler had fused his identity with the fate of Germany so completely that surrender felt like personal annihilation. The phone conversations show a leader incapable of empathy, still measuring worth through obedience even as millions suffered. Civilians starved in the rubble above, while he debated movements of imaginary divisions below. Human lives had become abstractions, sacrificed to preserve a narrative of destiny. As the hours dwindled, the tone of communication shifted. Orders became farewells disguised as commands. Authority drained away, replaced by ritual. In his final communications, Hitler sought not solutions but legacy, insisting on loyalty to the end, naming successors, and framing his downfall as a noble stand, rather than the consequence of relentless aggression. The telephone no longer connected him to power. It connected him to history, recording the last echoes of a regime built on fear. The consequences of these final calls rippled far beyond the bunker walls. Germany lay devastated, its cities broken, its people burdened with loss and guilt. Europe was scarred by genocide, war crimes, and mass displacement. The world learned, at an unbearable cost, what happens when ideology hardens into absolute certainty and a single voice silences all others. When the calls ended, so did the illusion. Silence followed, heavy, final, irreversible. Adolf Hitler died believing he had been betrayed by men, never acknowledging how deeply he had betrayed humanity itself. His last phone calls were not merely conversations, they were a confession of failure spoken into the void. They stand as a warning whispered from history's darkest chamber. When power rejects truth, when leaders confuse their will with destiny, and when human lives are reduced to numbers on a map, the end is never heroic. It is only quiet, devastating, and final. The telephone became Adolf Hitler's final instrument of command at the precise moment when command itself was slipping from his grasp. Deep beneath Berlin, encased in reinforced concrete, while the city above was reduced to ash and rubble, the Führer clung to the ringing of a handset as proof that his authority still existed. For more than a decade, his voice had traveled effortlessly across Germany and occupied Europe, issuing orders that reshaped borders, destroyed nations, and condemned millions to death. Now, in the spring of 1945, That same voice echoed through narrow bunker corridors, reaching fewer ears, carrying less weight, and confronting a reality it could no longer bend. The Führerbunker was not merely a military headquarters, it was a psychological refuge. As Allied bombers turned Berlin into a wasteland and Soviet artillery closed in from the east, Hitler withdrew physically and mentally from the world he had unleashed into chaos. The telephone lines running from the bunker formed a fragile connection to the outside, allowing him to imagine that the machinery of the Reich still functioned as it once had. Each call reinforced the illusion that armies still maneuvered at his command, that loyalty still outweighed fear, and that his will remained decisive. In truth, these calls exposed how thoroughly isolated he had become. From the earliest days of the war, Hitler ruled through centralized control, demanding absolute obedience while discouraging independent judgment. This system had functioned only as long as victory masked its flaws. By 1945, it had become fatal. Generals hesitated to tell him the truth, knowing that honest assessments would provoke rage rather than adaptation. Over the telephone, this dynamic intensified. Reports were filtered, softened, or delayed. Divisions that existed only on paper were spoken of as if they could still march. The telephone, instead of delivering clarity, transmitted fantasy. As Soviet forces encircled Berlin, Hitler used the phone to issue orders for counterattacks that were logistically impossible. He spoke of relief armies that had been annihilated weeks earlier, insisting that faith and willpower could compensate for destroyed infrastructure and exhausted men. When confronted with facts, his responses oscillated between cold disbelief and violent outbursts. He accused commanders of betrayal, accusing them of lacking the ideological purity he believed necessary for victory. The calls became confrontations, not conversations, monologues delivered to a shrinking audience. In these moments, the telephone revealed its symbolic power. It was no longer a tool for strategy, but a psychological prop. Holding the receiver, Hitler could imagine himself still at the center of events, still issuing commands that mattered. Without it, he would have been forced to confront the unbearable truth that the war was over and that his vision had failed catastrophically. The wire connecting him to the outside world became a lifeline not to Germany, but to his self-image. The deeper the collapse became, the more rigid his tone grew. Hitler had always equated compromise with weakness, and in defeat, this belief hardened into obsession. Over the phone, he rejected any suggestion of retreat or surrender, framing such ideas as moral crimes rather than strategic necessities. This rigidity sealed Germany's fate. Cities were destroyed fighting for symbolic ground. Civilians were sacrificed for pride, and soldiers were ordered to die for positions that held no military value. Each call reinforced decisions that multiplied suffering rather than reducing it. Psychologically, these final communications expose a man incapable of separating himself from his ideology. Hitler did not see Germany as a nation of people, but as an extension of his own destiny. If the Reich was doomed, then the people in his view had failed him and deserved their fate. This belief surfaced in the cold detachment with which he discussed civilian losses, even as Berliners starved and froze above the bunker. Over the telephone, human lives were reduced to numbers, movements, and abstractions, pieces in a narrative he refused to abandon. As days passed, the calls grew shorter and more strained. The once confident cadence of command was replaced by repetition, as if saying the same orders again might summon obedience from a world that no longer existed. Silence increasingly followed his words, pauses on the line where confirmation should have been. In those silences lay the truth he could not accept. Power, once absolute, had evaporated, yet even in collapse, Hitler sought control over how history would remember him. The telephone became a means of shaping legacy rather than strategy. He discussed succession, issued political directives, and framed the war's end as a betrayal by subordinates rather than the inevitable outcome of aggression. Calls were attempts to impose meaning on defeat. responsibility breeds denial, that leaders who silence truth will one day be surrounded only by echoes of their own voice, and that no ideology, no matter how loudly proclaimed, can survive its collision with reality. In the final weeks of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler's communications revealed not a master strategist fighting against impossible odds, but a man psychologically cornered by his own illusions. The telephone conversations that passed through the Führerbunker exposed a mind increasingly dominated by denial, punctuated by sudden eruptions of rage, and ultimately sealed off from reality by profound isolation. These calls were no longer instruments of leadership. They were emotional outbursts echoing through a collapsing world. Denial had long been a defining feature of Hitler's personality, but in April 1945 it became absolute. Despite overwhelming evidence that Germany was defeated, he refused to accept the scale of the disaster. Over the telephone, he demanded assurances that armies could still maneuver, that supply lines still existed, that reinforcements were on their way. When officers attempted to explain the truth, that divisions had been destroyed, fuel had run out, and soldiers were surrendering en masse, Hitler dismissed them as pessimists or traitors. Reality itself became the enemy. This denial was not ignorance, it was a psychological defense. To acknowledge defeat would have meant acknowledging responsibility for the devastation of Germany and Europe. Hitler's identity was inseparable from his ideology, and his ideology promised triumph or annihilation, nothing in between. In his mind, compromise was moral failure. The telephone conversations reveal how fiercely he clung to fantasy, because truth threatened to destroy not just his regime, but his sense of self. As denial hardened, rage followed. Witness accounts describe phone calls in which Hitler erupted into shouting fits, his voice trembling with fury as he berated generals for failures that were, in reality, the consequences of his own decisions. He accused seasoned commanders of cowardice, dishonor, and betrayal. These were not calculated reprimands. They were emotional explosions born of fear and helplessness. The more powerless he became, the more violently he asserted authority through words. This rage served a purpose. It shifted blame outward. By framing defeat as the result of disloyal subordinates rather than flawed strategy, Hitler preserved the myth of his own infallibility. The telephone became a courtroom in which he acted as judge and accuser, passing moral sentences on men who no longer had the means to obey him. Each accusation reinforced a narrative in which he was betrayed rather than defeated, yet rage also deepened his isolation. Officers learned that honesty was punished, not rewarded. As a result, reports became increasingly detached from reality. Bad news was delayed or softened. Impossible scenarios were presented as achievable. Hitler's temper had created an echo chamber in which only reassuring information survived. The telephone lines carried not facts, but what he wanted to hear. In isolating himself from truth, he ensured that every decision made in those final days was fatally flawed. Psychological isolation was further intensified by physical confinement. Underground, cut off from the world he once dominated, Hitler lived in a narrow, dimly lit environment that reinforced paranoia and suspicion. The absence of crowds, ceremonies, and public affirmation stripped away the performative elements of his power. Over the phone, there were no mass rallies, no thunderous applause, only strained voices and long silences. The contrast was devastating. These silences were perhaps the most revealing aspect of his final communications. Where once there had been immediate compliance, there were now hesitations. Where once there had been certainty, there was ambiguity. Each pause on the line represented the gap between Hitler's perception and reality. Instead of acknowledging this gap, he filled it with anger and accusation, pushing himself further into emotional solitude. His isolation also manifested in emotional detachment from human suffering. As Berlin burned and civilians hid in cellars, Hitler discussed troop movements and ideological loyalty with chilling abstraction. Over the phone, millions of lives were reduced to strategic considerations or moral judgments. This emotional numbness was not indifference, but a consequence of total psychological withdrawal. To empathize would have required him to confront the suffering he had caused, and that confrontation was intolerable. As defeat became undeniable, his denial transformed into fatalism. Some calls reflected a grim acceptance that the war was lost, yet even this acceptance was framed through ideological distortion. Hitler spoke of Germany's destruction as a kind of historical necessity, suggesting that a nation that failed him did not deserve survival. This chilling logic allowed him to detach completely from the people he claimed to represent. Isolation reached its final stage, separation not just from advisors, but from humanity itself. The telephone, once a symbol of connection, became evidence of disintegration. Each call highlighted the collapse of trust, the erosion of authority, and the psychological walls Hitler had built around himself. His voice still carried command, but no longer meaning. He spoke, but the world moved on without him. These final communications reveal a universal danger. When leaders surround themselves with fear, suppress truth, and equate personal identity with absolute power, denial becomes inevitable, rage becomes routine, and isolation becomes complete. Hitler's last phone calls were not merely historical details, they were psychological warnings. They show how power, when divorced from reality and accountability, does not end in clarity or redemption, but in anger, delusion, and profound loneliness. Blind ideology did not merely influence Adolf Hitler's leadership, it replaced judgment itself. In the final phase of the Second World War, Germany was not defeated solely by enemy armies, but by a system of command poisoned from within. Hitler's rigid ideological worldview destroyed honest communication, suffocated professional military judgment, and accelerated collapse from the top down. By the time of his last phone calls, the German command structure had become a hollow shell, obedient in form, dysfunctional in reality. From the beginning, Hitler believed that willpower and ideological purity were superior to experience, logistics, or strategic flexibility. Early successes reinforced this belief. Rapid victories in Poland and France convinced him that instinct mattered more than expertise, and loyalty more than competence. As a result, professional officers were gradually sidelined, overridden, or intimidated into silence. The German high command learned that truth was dangerous if it contradicted Hitler's convictions. Over time, honesty became an act of defiance. This erosion of honest command had devastating consequences. Military planning relies on accurate information, troop strength, supply lines, morale, and terrain. Hitler's ideology distorted all of these. He viewed setbacks not as strategic failures, but as moral ones. Defeat, in his mind, could only occur if someone lacked faith or loyalty. This belief turned reporting into a performance. Generals shaped their words to avoid his anger, offering optimism where none existed and certainty where chaos reigned. As the war turned against Germany, this ideological blindness intensified. Hitler increasingly interfered in operational decisions, issuing direct orders down to divisional level, often over the phone, without understanding conditions on the ground. Retreats were forbidden, even when tactically essential. Positions were ordered held to the last man regardless of strategic value. These commands were not military calculations, they were ideological declarations. The result was encirclement, annihilation, and the unnecessary loss of experienced troops. Germany could not replace the culture of fear within the command structure ensured that these fatal decisions went unchallenged. Officers who questioned orders risked dismissal, arrest, or worse. Some attempted to speak honestly, only to be shouted down or accused of treason. Others learned to survive by compliance. This dynamic created a leadership vacuum in which no one could correct course. The system no longer transmitted reality upward, it filtered it through ideology. By 1945, this breakdown was absolute. Hitler issued orders based on imagine, airy formations and non-existent reserves. Entire armies were spoken of as if they were still capable of movement when they had already ceased to exist. The telephone carried these commands outward, but there was nothing left to carry them out. Commanders on the ground faced impossible choices: obey orders that would lead to destruction, or disobey and face punishment from a regime already collapsing. Blind ideology also corrupted the concept of responsibility. Hitler believed that loyalty absolved him of accountability. If subordinates failed, they were traitors. If cities fell, commanders were cowards. If Germany collapsed, the people themselves were unworthy. This logic removed any incentive for honest self-assessment. Without accountability at the top, failure repeated itself unchecked. Each disastrous decision led not to correction, but to deeper denial. The impact on Germany was catastrophic. Armies were wasted in symbolic stands that achieved nothing. Civilian populations were sacrificed to preserve ideological narratives. Infrastructure was destroyed by scorched earth orders issued in the final days, not to slow the enemy, but to punish the nation for perceived disloyalty. These decisions did not prolong meaningful resistance, they magnified suffering. At the heart of this collapse was the destruction of trust. Effective command depends on mutual confidence between leader and subordinate. Hitler replaced trust with obedience. He demanded agreement, not truth. Over time, this transformed the German military into an organization incapable of adaptive thinking. Initiative vanished, creativity died. Commanders waited for instructions that no longer reflected reality, while opportunities for strategic withdrawal or negotiated surrender slipped away. The irony is that Germany possessed capable officers who understood the war was lost and sought rational solutions. But ideology had stripped them of authority. Their expertise meant nothing against Hitler's belief in destiny and will. The telephone conversations of the final weeks reflect this tragedy clearly. Seasoned professionals reduced to pleading, hesitating, or remaining silent, while a single voice dictated disaster. This ideological blindness did more than hasten defeat, it shaped the manner of defeat. Germany did not collapse through strategic exhaustion alone, but through internal paralysis. The system could not adapt because adaptation required admitting error. And error, in Hitler's worldview, was intolerable. Thus the war ended not with a managed surrender that might have spared lives, but with chaos, destruction, and total collapse. History records these events not simply as the failure of a dictator, but as a warning about systems built on unquestionable belief. When ideology overrides evidence, when loyalty is valued above truth, and when dissent is treated as betrayal, command becomes performance rather than leadership. Decisions lose contact with reality, and collapse becomes inevitable. Hitler's final phone calls echo with this lesson. They are the sound of a regime speaking to itself, issuing commands into emptiness, trapped by beliefs it could no longer defend. Blind ideology did not just blind Hitler, it blinded an entire system, accelerating its fall and leaving devastation in its wake. In the final days of the Third Reich, as Adolf Hitler spoke into telephones deep beneath Berlin, a vast human tragedy unfolded above him, largely unacknowledged, largely irrelevant to the words he chose to speak. The contrast could not have been more severe. While civilians huddled in cellars, children scavenged for food among ruins, and wounded soldiers bled in overcrowded hospitals, Hitler's conversations remained focused on authority, loyalty, and ideological resolve. Man's suffering existed at the margins of his speech, obscured by abstractions and eclipsed by his obsession with power preserved through words alone. By April 1945, Berlin was a city in agony. Continuous bombardment had reduced neighborhoods to rubble. Water, electricity, and food supplies were collapsing. Refugees flooded the capital from the east, fleeing the advancing Red Army, carrying stories of terror, loss, and desperation. In these conditions, leadership demanded empathy, realism, and urgent concern for civilian survival. Yet from the bunker, Hitler's voice carried none of these qualities. Over the phone, he spoke of divisions, positions, and loyalty, as if the nation were still a chessboard rather than a landscape of human misery. This detachment was not accidental. Throughout his rule, Hitler had cultivated an abstract vision of humanity. People were not individuals with fears and families. They were symbols of racial strength or weakness, instruments of historical destiny. In victory, this abstraction allowed him to mobilize masses with myth and spectacle. In defeat, it allowed him to disregard suffering without moral friction. The telephone conversations of his final weeks reveal this clearly. Reports of civilian casualties, refugee crises, and urban destruction were either ignored or reframed as necessary sacrifices. Pain became a background noise to ideological persistence. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, Hitler's indifference hardened into something colder. He began to speak of suffering not as tragedy but as judgment. If the German people were losing the war, he reasoned, then they had failed him and failed history. In this twisted logic, their suffering was not to be alleviated but accepted, even deserved. Over the phone, he issued orders that worsened civilian hardship, commands to hold cities at all costs, to destroy infrastructure rather Han let it fall into enemy hands. These decisions did not serve military necessity. They served pride. The psychological distance between Hitler and the population he ruled was absolute. Underground, insulated by loyal aides and controlled information, he did not hear the cries of the wounded or the hunger of the displaced. His only connection to the outside world came through telephones, and even then, he filtered what he heard. Conversations focused on obedience and resolve, not evacuation or relief. The preservation of authority, even symbolic authority, took precedence over human life. This pattern extended to soldiers as well. Young conscripts and exhausted veterans were ordered to fight on despite impossible odds. Units without ammunition, fuel, or medical support were commanded to hold positions to the last man. Over the phone, these orders were delivered with ideological language. Honor, duty, sacrifice, words that masked the reality of fear and death, awaiting those expected to obey. For Hitler, the act of issuing the order mattered more than its human cost. Speaking the command sustained the illusion of leadership, even as lives were extinguished by it. The tragedy lies not only in what Hitler said, but in what he did not say. There were no calls expressing concern for civilians trapped in Berlin, no discussions of humanitarian corridors, food distribution, or medical evacuation. Silence filled those spaces. The absence of empathy was as telling as the presence of command. The telephone lines carried power downward, but compassion never traveled with it. This emotional void had consequences far beyond the bunker. Local officials, bound by orders from above, felt compelled to enforce policies that prolonged suffering. Civilians were prevented from fleeing combat zones. Cities were defended long after any strategic value had vanished. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and aid was scarce. Yet ideological directives continued to arrive, transmitted through the same channels that could have been used to reduce harm. Words that might have saved lives were replaced by words that demanded loyalty. In his final communications, Hitler seemed increasingly concerned with how events would be interpreted rather than how they would be endured. He spoke of betrayal, honor, and legacy, constructing a narrative in which suffering served a higher historical purpose. This narrative required the erasure of individual pain. To acknowledge the suffering of real people would have exposed the moral bankruptcy of his cause. It was easier to speak in absolutes, to cling to language that elevated ideology above humanity. The human cost of this detachment was immense. Families were torn apart, cities erased. Generations traumatized. Yet in the bunker, suffering rarely pierced the walls of abstraction. Hitler's final phone calls demonstrate how power, when sustained only through words, becomes hollow. Authority spoken into a receiver could not feed a child, shelter a refugee, or heal the wounded. It could only demand endurance until there was nothing left to endure. When the calls ended and silence descended, the reality he had avoided became unavoidable. Germany lay shattered. Millions were dead. Survivors faced a future marked by loss and reckoning. The words spoken in those final days did not soften this outcome. They hardened it. They preserved a fiction of control while allowing suffering to multiply unchecked. These final communications offer a profound warning. When leaders value authority over humanity, when language is used to defend power rather than protect people, suffering becomes invisible and inevitable. Hitler's last phone calls remind us that the greatest danger is not merely cruelty but indifference. The willingness to speak of destiny while ignoring the lives being destroyed in its name. When the last phone calls ended and silence settled over the Führerbunker, history was left not with the image of a defeated general, but with a deeper and more unsettling lesson about human nature. Adolf Hitler's final communications were not simply the closing moments of a war. They were the final expression of unchecked authority collapsing under its own weight. They reveal how absolute power, once freed from accountability and truth, does not merely fail. It corrodes everything around it before destroying itself. For years, Hitler's authority had gone largely unchallenged. Institutions that might have restrained him were dismantled, subordinated, or transformed into instruments of loyalty. Courts, military command, media, and civil administration ceased to act as independent bodies and became extensions of a single will. This concentration of power created efficiency in the short term, but it also removed every safeguard against error. When mistakes occurred, there was no mechanism to correct them. When reality contradicted belief, reality was dismissed. By the time of his last phone calls, this system had reached its inevitable conclusion. Hitler was surrounded by ruins, yet still issuing commands as if obedience could reverse history. The calls demonstrate a fundamental truth. Power that cannot be questioned becomes incapable of learning. Each order repeated in the final days was not an act of leadership, but a refusal to adapt. Authority had become performance, sustained only by the sound of his own voice. Unchecked authority also reshapes morality. In Hitler's worldview, loyalty replaced ethics. Actions were judged not by their consequences, but by their alignment with ideology. This is why, even at the end, he could order cities destroyed, civilians sacrificed, and soldiers sent to certain death without hesitation. The absence of accountability removed the human cost from decision-making. When no one can say no, suffering becomes inevitable. The phone calls expose how dangerous it is when leaders equate themselves with the fate of a nation. Hitler no longer distinguished between Germany and his own legacy. To admit defeat would have meant admitting personal failure, and that was psychologically intolerable. As a result, the nation was dragged down with him. This fusion of ego and power is among history's most destructive patterns. When leaders believe they are history itself, they will sacrifice anything to preserve that illusion. There is also a warning about ideology hardened into absolute belief. Hitler did not merely hold ideas, he treated them as immutable laws. Evidence, experience, and human cost were irrelevant when they conflicted with doctrine. The final calls reveal a man still convinced that willpower could overcome material reality, that faith could replace logistics, and that loyalty could substitute for truth. This mindset ensured catastrophe. Reality does not yield to belief, no matter how forcefully it is spoken. Another lesson lies in the silence that increasingly followed his words. Authority depends not just on command, but on trust. Hitler destroyed that trust through fear and punishment. Over time, those around him stopped speaking honestly. By the end, he ruled an echo chamber. The phone lines carried his voice outward, but nothing meaningful returned. This is the fate of all unchecked power. It becomes isolated, cut off from the very information it needs to survive. The final days also demonstrate how language itself can become dangerous. Words were used to mask reality, to frame destruction as duty and death as honor. When language is stripped of truth, it becomes a weapon against understanding. Hitler's last phone calls were filled with grand phrases and ideological certainty, but empty of practical meaning. They show how rhetoric, when detached from reality, can prolong suffering rather than prevent it. Perhaps the most universal warning lies in how ordinary structures enabled extraordinary destruction. Hitler did not rule alone. He was obeyed by officials, officers, and institutions that chose compliance over conscience. Unchecked authority survives because people surrender responsibility, convincing themselves that obedience absolves them of guilt. The phone calls remind us that power is never exercised in isolation. It is sustained by those who repeat orders, carry them out, or remain silent. When the regime finally collapsed, it did not end with clarity or redemption. It ended in chaos, devastation, and moral reckoning. The silence after Hitler's last calls was not peace. It was the absence of illusion. What remained was the truth he had avoided. Millions dead, a nation shattered, and an ideology exposed as hollow and destructive. These final communications speak across generations. They warn that authority without limits will always drift toward denial, cruelty, and isolation. They show that leaders who silence truth eventually hear nothing but their own voice, echoing in empty rooms. And they remind us that the greatest danger is not power itself, but power unchecked by humility, accountability, and respect for human life. History does not remember Hitler's last phone calls because they changed the outcome of the war. It remembers them because they reveal how it ended, not just militarily but morally. They stand as a final, chilling reminder that when ideology replaces humanity and authority replaces conscience, the result is not strength, but ruin.